Let's go ahead and wrap us up. A couple things to say about the themes in Lewis overall. I did a more rigorous thematic survey of Tolkien, mostly because some of the themes in Tolkien are maybe harder to spot sometimes. Another thing is that the themes I'm about to give you for Lewis might seem a little shorter. Again, not because I think there are fewer themes, but in some of these cases, they parallel Tolkien, at least in name, or at least in subject, though what I'll say in just a little bit is there are certainly differences. But the themes, as I've sort of laid them out for you, and as I've noticed them in Lewis's fiction, can also be found in his nonfiction writings, which is one of the easier ways to spot them, frankly. He writes nonfiction on some of these themes, and therefore it's no wonder that they show up in his fictional writings. As I see them, they are the following. The first is authority, meaning the nature of it, the corruption of it, and the perversion of it at times, as well as good examples of authority in different ways. More on the differences there in a little bit, but that's one of the themes. The second one, and this is unique to Lewis than it is to Tolkien. They shared the similar views, but something about maybe it was just simply the fact that Lewis has the Narnia series in particular as school children coming from educations and going to Narnia, and he has opportunities more often to comment on the nature of education. Maybe that's one of the main reasons why this is so. But also Lewis, again, he wrote, The Abolition of Man was a profound critique of some instincts in modern 20th century education. So it's really only natural that we see some of this play out. But we saw it also in the Space Trilogy, this concept that the philosophy of scientific materialism doesn't just content itself to make comments about science or the natural world, but it always comes crashing into everything about life, education, the family, politics, ethics, all these things. So education and the nature of it. Now, I don't mean content of education, but the goal of education is one of the big themes in Lewis. What do we even read old books for? If you get one of the editions of Athanasius on the Incarnation, there's actually a preface that Lewis wrote called, I'm probably going to say it wrongly, but On the Reading of Good Books or of Old Books. And it's actually a wonderful, positive account as to why we read classics or read ancient texts. It's one of these books, these prefaces, these little, basically this little short chapter, essentially, where Lewis positively says, this is why we do humanities studies. And he saw it as under fire, so he talks about it. Third, character formation. Now, when he talks about character formation, he is not necessarily dealing with the soteriological questions of sanctification. Lewis does not seem to take these concepts of character formation and say, you must do this or else, you're no longer part of the kingdom or there's no grace. In other words, I don't think he's doing a Pelagian move by talking about character formation. Every time he talks about it, he just talks about it as the natural goodness or the natural good thing that a well-educated, serious thinking person ought to do. And he talks about it in a way that, again, he never seems to slip into soteriology, meaning he doesn't try to say this is part of sanctification. Education is not sanctification. He talks about character formation But I think he talks about that as something that is good for society as well as something that the Christian ought to embrace as well. Great. Yeah, not in the character development of the character per se, though that does sometimes occur. More in the men without chests argument from Abolition of Man that I mentioned, where we become simply the outworking of our desires or our gut, or just simply pure reason, that we lose a heart and a soul to it, to who we are. And that's one of his arguments for reading of classic books, humanities studies, is that they always have built into their worldview this idea of this shapes you. This worldview, this perspective shapes you. And so it's more us. It's more the theme of how these stories, these things affect us. Good question. I don't think, no, not in those words. He's not saying pagan myths have better virtues for us. It's always it's always who is he fighting? He's fighting scientific materialism, as we've said, this to give it kind of a name, or the ravages of the Enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it, modernism. And what he's saying is that perspective slices off any ability to be changed or formed externally. It's all about impulses, the synapses of my brain, firing chemicals, these kinds of things. And the reason why he is so pro-pagan literature is because he says at least they have something that forms them from the outside, which the gospel and the biblical story does as well. Now, they're not the gospel or the biblical story, but at least they're on our side of the proper hermeneutic, might be the word, the proper perspective on the way truth or our worldview or the mythopoeic ways of life shape us. Which again, this is why Lewis calls it the Bible true myth. It's a true story, it's historic, it's verifiable, he does all that stuff. Christ was resurrected. I mean, he is a defender of the full divinity of Christ. You know, he is one of the main people that does the argument that what Jesus has said about himself as Messiah means he's either a madman, so that kind of stuff. He's a strong defender of biblical truth. But what he's saying is the biblical story, if you want to call it that, the biblical grammar is from without, and it shapes us by coming into us, by being learned, by being felt, by being done, by being expressed, both in the imagination and in the head, these kinds of things. So, in other words, what he's saying about character development is not stories are equivalent to the fruits of the Spirit, or that they give you the fruits of the Spirit, but rather they train you to notice that that truth comes from without and shapes you within, that way. Big for Lewis, nature of good and evil. Whether it's run through the concepts of love that is perverted and love that is true, whether it's through profoundly evil characters like the White Witch, whether it's through profoundly good characters like Aslan. The nature of it, both, I would say Lewis has a macro scale and a very fine-toothed, simple, the small ways of good and evil and how they affect us. And we've talked about some of these. Obviously, Aslan and the White Witch, that's a big macro fight. That is good and evil. That is the Savior saving us. But he also does those little nuances of relationships. You see it until we have faces. You see it in other places in the Narnia series, etc., where evil can present in these small little ways that nevertheless will over time amount to more or will shape us more. Same thing with good. Little positive churns in the life of the Christian will build up. Take the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. You don't necessarily get lots of immediate conversion out of Eustace. It's the journey itself almost. The being around those who are good and true that seems to win him over by the end. So that when he goes back, it is said, it seems as if we hardly know the guy anymore. I don't want us to think that Lewis only does Aslan versus the White Witch. He will at times narratively do a more nuanced, well-intentioned person that does the wrong thing, even though they didn't intend to do the wrong thing, or the person who is unaware that they're stumbling down the path of providence that Aslan has laid before them, and they find out at the end, those kinds of things. Yeah. Lastly, the wildness of God. And I chose those words a little bit carefully. Wild in the sense of untamed, uncontrolled. Not wild in the sense of loud and crazy. The wildness of God. For Lewis, Aslan is uncontained. You cannot control him. It's one of the better ways that the concept of the Christ-like figure being a lion actually plays well into the story. You don't control a lion. A lion controls you, in a manner of speaking. And this sense of, I've mentioned it before, but I want to stress it, the way Aslan sort of runs into the scene sometimes, or he gives very specific advice, follow the signs, for example, and yet he doesn't always seem to be the one carrying them through each second. But then at the end you find out that he has. That there is a sense in which he does providence, he does oversee the children of Narnia when they're there, but that also he is untamed. He cannot be controlled in the sense of, to go back to the Till We Have Faces, the way the priests of the kingdoms control their God and they do these rituals to make him do things is really a counterbalance to what Lewis sees as the true God, which is you can't do things to make him do things. It's relational things that get God in a responsive relationship. So those are the predominant themes that pop out of Lewis again and again and again across all the books. There are more. We could belabor all of these even more deeply, but there are others. Yeah.
Just to do with the wildness.
Yeah, I think if you take Lewis's conversion and his biography, that's one certain source for why he sees God as so uncontrollable, that he came after me. The other is, I think you're right, the scientific, materialistic, deterministic worldview. If it has God at all, he's just a clockmaker, he's just a predictable machine. And Lewis does not want anyone to believe that is the God of the Bible, because he's not. All right. Last little stage of our time together is we're going to delve into some attempts to lay out a compare and contrast for you. And as I've said throughout, and I'm going to say it again, this is designed to kind of get your mind churning as to how you can look at themes from one and the other and see, are they similar or are they different? Okay? Lewis and Tolkien, for me, to just take these themes, I think there are a number of differences that you can lay side by side between the two of them. Even if it's on the same subject, it might be a different emphasis. For me, you look at Lewis on the left, God, as I've just said, is wild. He's unpredictable. He crashes into the story and changes it at times, rescues the story at times. Much in the sense of he is Lord, therefore he presents himself visibly and physically and in terms of power. For Tolkien, I put this in quotations on purpose, God is slow. Tolkien, he does this, particularly in elements of Lord of the Rings, where he's describing things like, why was Gollum allowed to live? Or why did it happen this way? Or I wish the ring had never come to me. These elements of challenging providence or how things have come. And Tolkien will not go, you could almost imagine in a Lewis scheme, that's almost when a very overt Christ-like figure crashes in and will change, affect, or monologue about some element that needs to be described. Tolkien very, very carefully, very slowly unfolds his story, and all the times when you think it is lost, it's not. All the times when it appears to be lucky or fate, that luck or fate that gets them to a certain point, he always will say, no, there's a providence at work here that is so veiled at times, they don't even have God by name mentioned in Lord of the Rings. It's mentioned in the Silmarillion, of course, but he almost wants us to remember that providence is always glimpsed from our perspective. Even in the biblical story, the only times you get a direct statement of this is God's providence is only when God tells them, hey prophet, tell them that I have done this and I am doing this. In other words, what Tolkien is always focusing on is we don't get that point of view. We can't be fatalistic. We have to live in the world from our view. We don't get to look from God's perspective down on providence. And as I said in the last lecture, very often God's providential support and love in our lives is only really known at the end. Think of Joseph and his whole torturous life. And at the end he goes, actually God meant all of this for good. Look where we are now. You get a lot of that sort of move in Tolkien. He doesn't want Christ or a Christ-like figure always to sort of solve the equation. Not that he doesn't believe that Christ is in control to that level, but in his stories, he wants to focus on our perspective, sort of layout of it. Did I see a hand? No. Yeah, there it is.
It's probably a bit like overseductive.
I think you have to end up going that way. I think Tolkien's robust Catholic faith drives him, I think that was a good word to use, institutional. I've engaged with a lot of Catholics over the years, just being a Reformation guy, that tends to happen. And you do get a lot of this kind of slow churning God. The church hasn't fallen in 2,000 years, they'll say. Why should we care now? Like, we'll fight the fight, but it's not that they're lazy, but you know what I'm saying? Like, they're not expecting an immediate influx of God right now. Whereas Lewis, in the evangelical Protestant camp at least, evangelical or at least Protestant camp, has more of a concept of the God of the immediate that does rescue in that fast sense. There's a long meditation theologians and Christians should do about their expectations about God's timing in our lives. Of course, a lot of you know I was raised in a charismatic faith. I'm profoundly appreciative of that. And I've always been appreciative of the fact that they anticipate God moving now. It's not he'll move in 3 generations' time. It's, we're going to pray and we're going to expect, but not in an arrogant sense. We're going to expect God to move because he's faithful and he will move. I've also, though, been around Eastern Orthodox people who say, you know what, this might take a long while. This might be my children's children who, if we're faithful, reap the benefit of our faithfulness. In that Abrahamic sense of that you care about covenants of children to children's children and these kinds of things. That if God doesn't move right now, they might say, if he does choose to wait until my children's children, he is still being faithful. Abraham prayed for so long and, he didn't get his answer for the promised son until quite some time. I think there's a good meditation that we could have on what do we expect God to work out in a certain time frame? And could we maybe be awoken to a different perspective on Scripture, or from Scripture, about when does God move? But I think this brings us to light. Tolkien, it's this long, slow, almost literally centuries of a story unfolding. And the end happens at the end. For Lewis, it's a lot more wild, hence the word, yeah. Pervasive evil, pervasive good. I'm not trying to overdraw this differentiation, okay? Do not make this stark differentiation. Lewis has just as much of a concept of pervasive good. It's maybe not as strong as his pervasive evil, and vice versa. What I mean by pervasive evil, pervasive good, is I find in Lewis, he's at his most profound when he's noticing, as I've said, the subtle twists and turns of sin and its effect on our psyche, on our thinking, on our relationships. People have said for decades that, something like Screw Tape Letters repeatedly he just almost seems to know how the devil works. And I don't think he's actually considering the devil on his own, but rather he's saying, here's what sin does to you and temptation does to you. And he gets it. And the counter to that is the four loves, where he shows how true love can work, godly love can work in us. But Lewis, people have always they've said he gets what evil does. Big scale, small scale. Tolkien is at his best, I find, some people find them quaint, but I don't, at the stories of the day in and day out grace of the table and the way he describes all the food and the fellowship and all these nuances that don't really, hobbits taking a bath and eating a meal doesn't really advance the plot very far. But what he has within him, because he talks about it in his letters and he talks about it in other places as well, is he has this day in and day out grace-saturated appreciation of the common, quote unquote. The common thing that isn't common because it's the gift of God. The daily bread motif, the giving of things to us that God gives us day by day. That there is a real subtle, pervasive enjoyment of the good in Tolkien throughout. One of my professors on Tolkien and Lewis when I was an undergrad, he pointed out very well to me. He said, at the end, the collapsing and the destruction of Mordor is a whimper, not a bang. He says Mordor just kind of the main stress of the story is Frodo's battle to get it there, and then of course Gollum biting his finger and he falls. But you don't see like the eye, like wailing and moving and monologuing during his death. It just evaporates. It just kind of goes. And of course, the Shire and Hobbiton and these places have this kind of pervasive goodness and thankfulness, you might even say, about the joy of creation. That is really Tolkien's wonderful ways of describing things. Now, obviously, again, I don't want to overstress this. Obviously, Tolkien and Gollum and the Ring and Mordor itself are very, very cogent and authentic stories of evil. And similarly, Aslan and all these things are pervasively with Lewis. But what I find if I were to say when is Tolkien at his best, it's in that day-to-day goodness of God's creation, that enjoyment, the little rests in life's journey or in the journey to destroy the ring, these things. And I find if I were to say when is Lewis at his best, for my money, it's when he is profoundly showing or describing sin and narcissism in our lives. Yeah. Amen.
You said that with fighting all the
Yeah.
over the paragraph.
Yeah.
Same thing.
You want the video game move where, left, right, up, down, and then he stabs him in the throat.
King of Angmar. You want this, 10-page battle. And trying to say
Yeah, well, and that was one of the first times I really saw what one of the major this as a reality of Tolkien. He doesn't. This seems to be the way he's doing this. He doesn't want evil to be seen as an equal force. He wants it to be a serious threat. But whenever you treat the powers of evil as an equal force, what you end up doing is you glory in its destruction, and you try to make it again in sort of typical cinematic settings. You try to come up with this. If it wasn't for that special move, the flying crane kick, then we wouldn't have beat that Balrog. These kinds of things. Cobra Kai, of course, is an awesome bad guy. But anyway, I'm a little punch drunk. It's been a long day. But Tolkien will never, literally the Balrog and Gandalf fall, and you're like, oh. And then, Gandalf shows back up and describes loosely what happened. It's like, we battled to the ground, and then, that kind of thing. He doesn't glory in the fight of it, and he almost, put it this way, he doesn't give evil that much press attention. That he doesn't give them the front page. They are the cause for good to flourish and to go after the destruction of evil. He doesn't. Another motif that happens a lot in modern day fiction, whether it's fantasy or not, is you get chapters where you see things from the inside of the evil perspective. So like, you may have a couple chapters where you're following this character, and then a little jump to you're following the bad guy now, and you're seeing his thought process. It's telling that you never really get you never get a first-person perspective of the evil characters. You never get to hear, you're only witnessing Gollum. You're only witnessing Sauron or Sauron. You're only seeing them from the advantage of those who are part of the fellowship, those kinds of things. So at the end of it, Tolkien very much wants us to identify with the fight, but then focus on the heroism and the strength and the providence of the fellowship and of the hobbits sometimes. Sometimes he's focusing on Gandalf, etc. But that's where his focus is, I think, more often. So, along those same lines, Lewis will focus on the foolishness of some people. A lot of this is very clear, I think, when you just sort of take the Narnia series, for example, and the Fellowship of the Rings, or the Lord of the Rings, rather. Even Lewis's protagonists, even some of his best people can be bozos. They are faulty, frail humans who screw up a lot. And not to make everything about Protestants and Catholics, but in that very Protestant sense of fallenness, original sin, and total depravity. And of course, total depravity does not mean utter depravity. It just means that we are always subject to fallenness, and we can screw up a lot. For Lewis, the only character who never screws up is Aslan. All the others seem to misstep, misapply, mishear, miss something along the way. Repeat sheep comes close, but even he does some dumb stuff at the end. But the only person who never screws up is Aslan. If you look at Tolkien's, though, there is again, in that sense, there is a pervasive appeal to the wisdom of some people as called by God to lead these kinds of things. The hobbits act like knuckleheads every now and again, but more in a comedic sense, more in a foolhardy, too quick to act sense, never out of spite necessarily. There's always tinges of this. But Gandalf and Aragorn and these other characters are almost biblical in some of their qualities that they don't, in some of their cases. Now, there's not many biblical characters that don't screw up, but still. They almost have this, Gandalf's a bit like a Moses character. He is sort of called to do these things. And if he is lacking anything, it's that he's lacking information, or that he's lacking insight into what is the end result of where they ought to go. He's not. That's actually one of that is one of the few beefs I have with the movies, both the Hobbit ones and the Lord of the Rings, is they make Gandalf occasionally tempestuous and annoyed and frustrated. And I don't, I don't find that necessarily in the books. I find he is, as at least my first experience reading Lord of the Rings was, that guy's awesome. Like you're gravitating to him because there is a flawlessness at times. Not in the Christological sense. Aragorn as well. He doesn't seem to. He is unwavering and unmoved in his mission. And again, I'm not saying that Tolkien believes that these characters should be seen as perfect. Therefore, we ought to be perfect like them. But rather, he's holding up a paragon of this is what goodness and wisdom and truth, idealized, can almost embody. And that they almost become beacons of light in the narrative that sort of draw things, sort of the story behind them. Yeah. Right. Yeah. No. And we mentioned that briefly when we were in Tolkien, that the Order of the Wizards is one that they're. And this is where the Silmarillion helps us. The reason why Gandalf sometimes seems to do nothing is because his role is not to save all the situations. He's actually there. The wizards come into the world, or the Ainur, the lesser angels, because they actually want to appreciate and learn from it. So the scholarship of them is they want to explore creation. This is why Radagast, that brown wizard with bird stuff in his hair, is out in the woods. It's not that he's weird and lost his mind. The idea there is that this is why I don't like the movie depiction of him. He's supposed to be enjoying, studying, learning, and embracing God's creation in the natural order, whereas Gandalf has other things that he studies and this kinds of thing. And you're right, when the Balrogs come, it's that there's only sort of certain moments where Gandalf will say, all right, I got to step in here. And it's usually against an equal enemy. Yeah, I would go that way, a perfect calling, not a perfect person, as a appropriate way to describe biblical character. I mean, that certainly describes David, Moses, Abraham. I mean, they're not perfect people, but they have a perfect calling to follow God's covenant.
God did something perfect through that.
There you go. Or his purposes were always met. I think what the way I'd probably put it is with Tolkien, he is not afraid to have characters who almost seem to be perfect, not because he expects anything in the real world to accord with that perfection, but and this is why he can say sometimes Gandalf seems like Christ, sometimes Aragorn seems like Christ, etc., because they all hold out. I think the word I would use is an idealized set of characteristics and convictions and purposes that seem superhuman, but they work, if that makes sense. You're drawn to them in a way, and maybe and the fact that they are not Christ, that they're not Aslan, they're just characters. It just works. And besides, what he's basically written in Lord of the Rings is a heroic tale, a saga, which always has usually some really awesome dude or dudette who is like doing some main calling. And so he's using that medieval motif to great effect. Lewis just seems to want all humans to actually act human. And he wants all Christ-like figures, Aslan basically, to act like Christ. And he reserves the perfect ideal for that character more, if that makes sense. Now, last one in terms of differences, the difference between joy and everyday life. Now, that word joy, I'm using in the way that Lewis does. That kind of ecstatic, momentary, just being surprised by this shaft of light into the imagination or into the soul where you go, I see something that is above and beyond me. Again, it fits, that motif fits with a wild God. That sometimes he just shines a shaft of light in and says, I'm still here. These moments of joy let you know that you're not alone, kind of a thing. Tolkien, you do have some of that. You do have that in Lothlorien when you go and sometimes get around the Elvis characters. There's these moments of being kind of lifted up. And there are moments of very punctuated grace. I think the lambus bread is certainly Eucharistic, and it's certainly a moment of punctuated grace. But the vast majority of the story is more about the grace of everyday life, the ongoing, sustaining grace. I think both are biblical themes, by the way. Sometimes there's an eruption of grace. There is this shaft of light that says, I am God. This is to let you know I'm here. At times, it's the everyday today thing. It's, some of you will go home from here and play with your kids. That's one of those everyday moments of grace. Some of you will go home from here and just take a nap. That's a little bit that will probably feel more graceful. So, the day in and day out graciousness of God is something we under focus on in our preaching. We always want, again, that shaft of light. And that's one of the reasons why I tend to gravitate towards Tolkien. He always reminds me that it's the everyday, the day in and day out, where you can find these moments of just joy. That sometimes you have to remind yourself of it, rather than wait for the shaft of light to sort of come in and sort of present itself to you. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Sure. Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, it's a bit like I grew up in Florida and I love cold weather. That's at least an analogy there. And again, I grew up in a very immediate God needs to act now, and so I've found myself appreciating more being reminded of the day in and day out. And I think it's no surprise that the charismatic movement, one of the fastest groups that it's growing in is in Catholic circles, where you can almost get this sense of The slow lethargy of the institution needs to be sprung awake by the coming of the Holy Spirit. I do think there are impulses in us that we have to, and this is why I do like this contrast, is you say, it's sometimes the shaft of light that just hits you upside the head. Sometimes it's stop that and just notice the day in and day out grace that you're given. I find it I don't find it to be much of a problem then when I actually gravitate towards it when, the Chesterton line that, the imagination is being shocked that there's even a door there. You don't have to invent a fire-breathing dragon behind the door to get us excited. We're just shocked at creation itself because it's so exciting. That's more Tolkien. That's more what Tolkien is on about, which is the everyday, the quote common which is not common because it's part of creation. Last little steps, similarities. This will be the last sort of place we'll go. I can't make everything about disjointedness. I'm not going to unpack all these. I just kind of want to lay them in front of you as we go out from the class. They all affirm, I think, the following 8 things. In their own ways, with their own tones of voice, with their own narrative structures, they all have within their stories the following. God is in control. I don't know if some of you might not have thought Tolkien's taught that or believed that before this class, but ideally by now you feel that more, particularly after the Silmarillion. Going to the right, evil must be fought. They are not, and nor should any Christian be fatalistic. In the sense of, I'm just going to wait for God to win, to fight this fight for me. Jesus take the wheel sounds pious, but it's pious nonsense. Jesus invented the wheel for your hands. He's not going to drive it for you. Now, of course, that's not the allegory there or the metaphor there. But still, God does empower us and equip us in the work of the kingdom. He can do it all himself. That's the important theological premise. But he has chosen not to do everything himself by the calling of you bozos to ministry. And I mean that lovingly. But he has called you to ministry, and he has equipped you, and he's moved your hands and your feet and your heart and your mind to do these things. You can embrace that. It's not that we wait for everything to be fought for us. Again, both Lewis and Tolkien have this sense of, at times, God's people are called to action, we might say. They both clearly have a concept that heroes are small. Now, they have big heroes. They have Aslan, they have Aragorn and Gandalf. But Tolkien said very explicitly the hobbits, and in particular Samwise, were the heroes of the story. And you can't help but notice that in Narnia, these little kiddos are the main people following Aslan. They're not the heroes, per se, in the sense of saving themselves or doing everything on their own. They have Aslan there with them. But they are frail little short heroes, much like hobbits can be. They both do focus on character formation. They do like the idealized heroic sagas of bravery. They like concepts like bravery, fighting for truth, steadfastness, all these things that what we consider to be sort of classic virtues. They both don't shy away from them in terms of their characters and in terms of what they're holding out as a good ideal. For example, they both teach that bravery is necessary. They also teach, one step below that authority is necessary. You can't be authoritative, you can't lack authority. The last two comes from who they are as scholars. They're both big on the formative value of learning languages, learning from the past, studying history, reading old books, these kinds of things as just a good way to wake up who you are to something more than who you are. And lastly, and not leastly, there is this somewhat occasionally nuanced understanding of how pagan sources should inform Christians. Not be adopted always by Christians, but be something that Christians know and appreciate and see with appropriate Christian eyes, but which they use. They're not scared of pagan sources as somehow having a magical power within them, that if they feel free to use those sources or those motifs from time to time. And I've done my best to explain some of the why they might be inclined to do that, whether it's attacking scientific materialism, whether it's just simply they appreciate it, though they don't embrace the theology or the philosophy of paganism, whatever it might be. But they both stand in that world of embracing medieval or Renaissance characters. Okay. We are done.